In this video, I'll be covering some general workflow techniques to follow when developing Fulcro applications. A lot of people haven't worked with ClojureScript, and this might be their first attempt at writing an application. I would recommend reading some, trying to build a few simple things before watching this particular video, as it assumes some knowledge of various things. So what I've done here is I've used Line to generate a new project. Basically, I did line new Fulcro workflow, and that created me a new project. I've gone ahead and I've set up a run configuration for devcards, standard according to the instructions that you'll find in other places. I've got that running. It is built. The default devcards page for the template is this at the time of writing. There's an existing SVG placeholder devcard, and so I'm going to walk you through a technique I find particularly handy for working up a new application. So a user on one of the members of the Slack channel was asking about developing a little play app for tracking pets and their favorite foods. So he wanted to, what would be the approach for developing something where I have pets and foods and pets with favorite foods and little forms for editing the two, and then maybe making that full stack, etc. So this may turn into a multi-part video, but I did want to get started on that. So what I've already done is I've created a pet cards namespace and put some requires into it. I'll go ahead and put a card in here. Just to get something rendering. I've put that in the cards. No, I haven't. So the files that I'm working on here, cards is the entry point. Intro has the SVG placeholder. Pet cards is the thing I want to work on. So I'm going to add workflow pet cards to my requires. And over here I'll see a hot code reload and I'll see my page appear. So now I'm all set to go. So the approach I suggest is first to develop what you want things to look like. And that can evolve over time, and it's obviously going to be much more detailed than what I'm going to show in the video because we're in the interest of time and boredom. And the plain def card in devcards is great for that because it just literally renders what you give it. So I give a DOM and I say it's got to do in it. If I change the value that I'm passing to that particular DOM, it just re-renders. It's a really fast feedback cycle. So I'm just working on what things look like. This is a really rapid place to do that. As soon as I save, I see the update. Now, I'm not likely to want to use just plain old React DOM generators because those aren't very interesting, right? I'm more likely going to want to write my own components. And the core macro for that in Fulcro is defsc. So let's say I was going to define a pet component. I'm going to have this in props to start. Let me talk about the project file because I've modified that slightly to add a few more dependencies. So the Fulcro template does not come with, and I didn't actually do it yet. It doesn't come up with the Fulcro CSS library, so I'm going to add that. And was there anything else I needed to use? No, that's the latest Fulcro at the time of this recording. I'm going to refresh line again so it gets that, and then I'm going to have to restart my build so it can see that dependency. So I've added Fulcro CSS. That's going to let me use component localized CSS, which I wanted to demonstrate in this workflow video as well, because I think it's a particularly useful thing to be able to do. Okay, so go back to the cards. I'm going to define a pet, and initially let's just say we're going to have a pet name. So I'm going to say dom div nil, and then I'm just going to render the name of the pet, right? So really, really, really simple. I'm going to assume that the pet name is going to come to me through props. So I'm going to have pet name coming in, and then I'm going to have a factory. All things are good, I get Fido over on the left, and I've still got basically just a div. Now, since I'm developing a component, and it's meant to be a stateful thing that works in a Fulcro application. I'm going to go ahead and add some attributes here that turn this into something that's more usable in an actual Fulcro application. So I'm going to start with I'm actually going to start with the CSS things because I might want my pet name to be something formatted in some way. So I'm just going to call this rule pet name. So in the CSS rules, it's just a vector of rules. Each rule is a vector. You use a keyword, so it always starts with a colon. Dot is just like CSS, it's a class name, so I'm creating a class name called pet name. Now this will be localized to my namespace and to my component. And then I'm going to say, you know what, the color is red. I want pets' names to be red. And as soon as I've added CSS support, which is this require here, defsc gives me an additional parameter. So this parameter is computed, I'm going to ignore it, and the next one are CSS class names. So I don't want to have to figure out what the convoluted localized class name is, and so I can destructure pet-name, the class that I used here, out of this fourth parameter. And then I can plop that here as just a variable, and now I've joined the class name that my CSS is going to generate with the div. Now you notice nothing happened in my UI over there, and that's because I've not installed the CSS in the UI. And I'll need another div for this because devcard only lets you put one thing in here. And so I'm just going to use a CSS style element for pet right inside of a DOM element, and now Fido is red. And if I inspect this, I'll see that I've got this workflow pet cards pet name color red as a class. And if I look a little more closely at the actually the elements got compressed in here, so styles computed event listener. There. We can see there's the div class, and the class name ended up being installed for me. So this is the layout I was looking for. Okay, so oops, wrong key. Okay, so that gives me a really quick way to interact with updating the styles on something, so that as I work it out, I might want to format this however I want to format it, put some padding in, etc. And I can do my CSS localization there. And as I develop the app, you can see I can push this further and further up. So we're going to start off with pet, with just some CSS. And when we start to turn this into a real Fulcro app, of course, we'll have a query here. And the query is probably going to need a DB ID, and we'll just say the pet name for now. There's probably going to be things like pet breed, pet whatever. Right, so there's some other things that we might include in our, but the more details I add there, the more time it just takes, and it doesn't really add anything interesting. And pets are going to have an ident, and we're just going to say these are pets by ID, using dbid as the ID field. And so now I've got something that can act as a real pet that can be used in a more full application scenario, right? It has the data needed for normalization, for querying, for co-locating the CSS, for destructuring that, and for rendering it. So this is a complete standalone component now, and I can look, I can create various cards that render pets. Maybe I can just have one, where maybe I want to check out really long names and really short names, and have those renderings show up. And I'm passing just literal props, and so plain old devcard is great for this, because you just want static rendering. That's great for visual regressions. It's great for just tuning the UI without having to worry about anything but I've written a component. So now let's move to something a little more, or let's start composing things. So let's say I want the list of all my pets. So I'm going to have a pet list. Same sort of exercise. And I could do the same sort of trick here. I could have CSS's co-located for this particular component. And the query here, I'm going to have something like join on pet list / pets, get query on pet. All right, so a pet list has the list of pets. It's going to have an ident. And maybe there's only one pet list, and so maybe we don't need anything but a static ident. So it's the pet list pane, whatever, an ID that doesn't have to mean anything. Okay, so the pet list can be normalized. And we have the query. And now it might be useful to include some initial state in these components for just sample purposes. So this isn't meant to be anything other than used for development. You're not going to have initial pets in your application when it starts up. Those are going to come from a database. But there's nothing to say you can't include initial state on the components that can be used to demonstrate things. In fact, you could even destructure from the parameters. Maybe you want people to be able to pass you a name when they're testing things. You'll just throw the name here. So I've got a pet, and I can create instances of that pet for my initial state if I want to. And of course, if you don't use the initial state and compose it to root, it doesn't end up in your app state. So we can move down here and we can see, all right, so for pet list, at least while we're playing with it here, initial state is a function that takes parameters. And what we're going to do here is we're going to destructure maybe pets as a parameter. And we're going to say, you know what, in the initial state of pet list, if you give me some pets, then I'm going to have pet list pets of pets. And maybe it's, oh, actually, maybe we should do something like that. So we always have a decent initial state for the pet list. It can just be empty. And then, of course, we can build up from there. Oops, if I could hit the right key. Maybe this is going to be an unordered list, and we're going to map over UI pet for pets. And then, of course, we need to destructure pets from what we've queried. So now we've got a query join, initial state, an ident, so that gets normalized, some optional CSS rules that we might end up including. And here we could also do CSS include of pet. We know we render pet, we should include the CSS for pet so that we can compose that CSS. You can see this if you do the doc string on defsc. It includes these additional parameters for CSS and CSS include. So now what we can do is we can still say devcard pet list card. We can still do the same exercise of I want to have just a static rendering of pet list. And in this case, pet list is expecting a map that has pet list pets in it, where then it has some pets. So again, we can do this exercise of rendering a card where we get something, and now we might go up and say, you know what, yeah, pets are an LI. Is that right? more thing here. We're probably getting, I'm guessing we're getting warnings down here about child or iterator should have a unique key. I didn't add a React key, and so we should definitely add a key function here. And then I'm going to reload the card there, so the static elements of configuration don't get reloaded by devcards. So when you're developing with devcards and you change the query, right, there's two ways we could do this. We could either have things update, in which case live code might close over some things you've changed and then you wouldn't see it update, or we can keep it static, and then there's just some finagling here. So some of these static configuration things you have to reload the entire page to get updates. So you can see both cards updated with my list item rendering. And down here, it just so happens, that my style element is getting installed by this card for pet. So if I get rid of that card, I lose my style element, which is fine. And part of the reason I wanted to do that is because now you can see that if I drop a style element in place, pet list, for pet list, I'll get that back, because pet list has this composition effect. So you can see I'm building from kind of the leaves of my program towards more complex components, and as I go I can just continue to compose. Now at any point, if I'm curious about how this is going to work as an application, when I can graduate to a more interesting kind of card, and that's devcard Fulcro. This macro creates a devcard that runs a given component as a full-blown application. And it's sometimes useful to go ahead and create a mock root, just so that you can pretend like you're going to embed it in something else. So pet list root this props, and this allows you to get things like the style element outside of these guys. So in this particular card, right, I'd have to play with this a little bit. I'd probably separate my visual regression stuff out to a separate development namespace, so that I could go to a different page and see these, so I'm not always injecting these different pieces. So actually I'm just going to leave this one commented out as if we moved it to a different namespace, or for that matter just delete it, because it really doesn't matter to me at the moment. So my pet list root, it's going to have these same sort of parameters, and really the only thing I'm going to render in here is UI pet list, and I'm just going to create a destructured parameter, put in a query that's a join on the list for a pet list. And so here's where, if I were composing this guy in, if I expect pet lists to come from a server, I would not compose in the initial state. I can leave it on the components, and as long as I don't compose it, it won't show up. But if I do compose it, and so here's a great right, I need to mirror the thing I'm queried for with a join. I'm sorry, a join I'm querying for with a map that contains that thing. And pet list, I've given an initial state that can just create something if I give it pets as a parameter, and then a vector of the pets I'm interested in. And I could go ahead and manually compose in some pets. And remember, I said I'm just going to supply a name, so I'm going to have Fido and Lassie. And then roots don't get an ident. So I've got a query, I've got initial state, I've destructured it, UI pet lists coming in there, reload to get initial state into the card, and now you can see pet list live has the wrong list of animals. Pets, pet name, oh, same ID. So they collapsed down to one element because I gave them the same React key. So I do need to require an ID here so that these guys have unique ID, or else I just get that problem. And again, since that's a static piece of information there, I'll have to reload to see the updated thing. Now once the application is running, I can use some dev tool magic here to show me the app database that ended up being there. So you can see I've got this pet list root that's querying for the list, which points to the pet list pane. Pet list pane has my pets, which point to that pet and that pet. And so hopefully you can see this is a really handy tool. I mean, you can use Fulcro inspect, which I have not got installed currently on the dev cards on this template, to pop open a database and do history and such. But I find that in dev cards, because you can see the database of individual components, it's really quite handy to just work with it directly with the inspect data. Now this does slow things down because it pretty formats this and re-renders it, and it's a big DOM update. So this can get rather heavy if it's a big database and make your application that's embedded in the card feel slow. So if you feel slowness when you've got inspect data on, it's because of this rendering, not your component rendering. If you flip this back to false, you'll see it perform much better. All right, but now that I have a pet list root, I could actually interact with this application, add mutations to it, etc. And as we've seen in other videos, since the mutations are localized to things like database tables, those mutations are actually portable as you continue to compose the application and make it a larger UI tree, etc. None of those things has to change because they really affect a localized app state. So this is a really great property of developing with dev cards, is you really can build these components up a piece at a time and see things going. And so to demonstrate that, pet list isn't particularly interesting because, well, I mean, there's not much to do to a pet list. I guess you could remove an item from the pet list, right? Remove this ident, and that could be interesting. But let's go ahead and add in another piece here. Let's make a pet form, and actually I'm just going to copy pet itself because pet itself is pretty close to what a pet form would look like. And let's get rid of pet breed because we're just not going to develop that during this little demo. And maybe I'm not going to add my own CSS because I could use the CSS from pet even. I'm not going to show you how to do that right this moment, but all right, so let's say we make a div and a DOM label HTML4 helps if I put that in quotes. And so I want this to be a controlled input of either the name or blank. I don't want that to ever be nil because React doesn't like it if you convert uncontrolled to controlled components suddenly. So we always want that to have some sort of value, even if our database doesn't yet have a value. This is going to be a text input, and that's all I'm going to do for the moment. And then, oh, this should have an ID. And initial state here, same kind of helper if we want it, same kind of query, same kind of destructuring. And this will normalize to the same database table. We're really going to edit the entity in place. We just have a different rendering for the same thing. It's also possible that we might want to combine these things and let people edit directly on the pet in the list just by clicking on this list item. But let me just go ahead with what I've got here. All right, so I have a query, I have initial state, I have ident, got the destructuring. I've shown you how to do the CSS. I'm not going to repeat that. What I do want to show, though, is how you start to make interactions. And again, since that's normalized, I can just kind of go through here. Compose the form, destructure the form, get myself a factory for the form. And so now, again, reload to get the, okay, so pet list pane didn't normalize. Oh, I didn't give an ident, or must have deleted the ident by accident. I was typing rather quickly there. Pet form root, ident. Oh, no, I did. Pet by ID. Oh, wrong query. If you don't get the query right, you won't get the normalization right. All right, so now we have a pet by ID. Everything's normalized the way I would expect it to be. And of course, we've got helpers for dealing with UI elements that are, form-like, local, but tied to the entity. And so we could put in an on-change handler here already. Based on the event coming from the on-change. And now I've already got editing where you see the database updating. So you can see I've just instantly got a live application, and I've got that form. I can play with the form in isolation in a card. Now you might ask, okay, well, you've got the form in isolation in a card, you've got the pet in isolation in a card. All right, what if you wanted to build it up so that you can like click between the list to the form to edit the name and then go back, etc. Same sort of thing. So we could add in, for example, routing. Oh, let's go ahead and pull in the and let's see, now we give the router a component name, so let's call this the pet widget. I don't know. And I don't know, pet router. And the routers need an ident function. And when we're flipping around here with routers, we get this in a props, and then we need to generate an ident where the first element of the ident that we pull out ends up being which screen we want to go to. So in this case, I'm just going to define that as screen, the screen in the props, and then in this particular case, there's not going to be different IDs for the different screens, so I'm just going to call it pane, right? Because I can already see the pet list pane is what I called this pet list, and so I can do something similar for a wrapper for the form, and I can end up with something that works out well. Now, I don't currently have on pet list a property known as screen. Oh wait, that's pref list. Yeah, pet list. Okay. I'm just trying to decide if I want to actually put that property on the pet list entity or not. Because there's another thing I could do, and that's if I leave pet list alone, it's going to generate pet list pane as its ident, and in its state, it's always going to have pet list /pests. pets, pests, pet list slash pets. It's hard to say that 3 times. So what we could do here is we could say if contains, is that the right order? I can never remember that. Collection, yes. Pet list pets. Then what we use for the first element is a pet list, otherwise it's a pet form. Okay, so our ident here is either going to be pet list pane or pet form pane. Right? So that's what we need to get here. And then naming convention wise, we need to have a pet list entry to go with, well, what shows that. And we already have pet list that can do that. It's got the right ident that matches our ident function. It's got everything it needs. So we'll just put pet list in there, and then pet form. In this particular case, the pet form itself, I think we're going to want an additional component for that. We could just steal the pet form root. And again, this first element of the ident has to match what this is going to generate as the first element of the ident. And same thing with the second element. It's going to generate pet form pane. This guy's ident needs to be pet form pane so that the normalization and such happens. And pet form, the form. Yeah, I think we're okay there. And for the moment, I'm just going to wipe that guy out because, again, I'm just trying to walk you through what the individual pieces look like. And this is telling me when I did my ident up here, I need to tell it that it's a plain Jane ident as opposed to. Now a router needs to be embedded in a root, so I'm back to needing a, another app root. And here I'm going to want just the, I'm just going to call it router. Just because and then the query is going to need to be a join on router to the query of the pet widget, which is the router. Initial state. And we should get the initial state of the router. Now, in this particular case, my initial state is not, oops, it needs a map to say that's the router state. This all has to match. And then if I were to say define a UI pet widget as this router that lets me switch between these two things. Now, the initial state of a router will get the initial state of these guys. So the pet form pane will get a pet with Fido in it in this particular case. And as will, let's see now, it's also getting the pet list. It'll ask for the initial state of the pet list. The pet list won't get a sequence, so the pet list will actually be empty in this particular case. So I'm probably going to need to add some operations to put some data in the database. And in fact, I probably in the pet form don't want Fido to be in there. So I might choose to refactor this at this point and maybe pass in affect things. But let's go ahead and see if we're getting close to making this work. So devcard. Okay, so we got the router points to routers by ID pet router. Routers by ID pet router is a pet router that's currently pointing to the pet list pane. And since there are no pets in the pet list, right, we're getting nothing. We've got one pet whose name is Fido that is normalized onto the pet form, which, as I said, that's kind of what I expected. The pet form's already going to be formed there. And now we're probably interested in formatting this out a little bit. And getting a little more UI showing up. And we'd probably do some sort of unordered list thing in order to let us switch between, well, we could start out this way, the pet list and the pet form, and we probably wouldn't leave these here. I'm planning kind of making these links just to try some routing mutations. So on click of this one, what I want to do is find the right route to, and I want key handler. Oh, nope. That's if I set up a routing tree. Let's just make our own mutation. So let's make a mutation called show pet form. Yeah, that seems reasonable. And one that shows show pet list. And note, these are going to be reusable. I can move them to different namespaces as long as I fix the aliasing up. It doesn't hurt anything for me to just throw everything in this one file to play with it and then factor things apart, like source-wise, as I go. And so I don't care about the params on this particular guy. I'm going to have an environment where I get the state. And for the simple kind of oh, actually I can use set route. So set route takes the router ID and then where I want to go. So I'm trying to go to the pet form. So that's, what was that, the pet form pane? Yeah. And then that's going to be the pet list pane. And now I can see, the form appearing and disappearing, which is showing that I'm, most likely routing between the two screens. And I can see I'm on pet form pane, now I'm on pet list pane. And so even though the pet list is empty, those two things work. So you can see I can now quickly add mutations. So let's take that form of routing out, because that's not really what we're going to do. We're going to start the pet widget out on a pet list. The first thing that you list in this router will be the thing that shows up. And then we're going to write mutations that let us click on these individual items. So in the pet list really doesn't know what to do if things are clicked on, nor does pet itself, but pet itself is where we probably want to take the click. Right? This is where we actually selected a particular pet. And so what we'd like to do here is call an onSelect kind of callback, where we can pass the ID of the pet. So now we can destructure dbid out of our parameters up here. So that's kind of what we want to do, and that can just be, you know, quick lambda. And so we'll use computed for that. So that's what this third parameter is. It's for passing in things like callbacks. So we're going to say when you click on a pet, let's not throw exceptions if onSelect isn't defined. When you click on a pet, it does whatever the onSelect action is, passing it an ID. And of course something has to pass that to this guy. And so, oops, we would normally just pass the pet through, and in this particular case we can just pass it through unmolested. Whatever computed we get on pet list, we don't care, we're just passing it through to UI pet as computed for the pet. And again, we could make this a lambda and throw % in here. I just sometimes think it's a little easier to read the variable names. Okay, so that's pet list. We're trying to pass computed all the way through if we do that, which is a little harder. So actually, let's just stop at pet list and define the mutation there. Because when we're going above the router, we're actually going to have to, we're going to be running a routing operation anyway. So we're not going to pass this through. Instead, we're going to pass whatever this does, and this is going to run a transact on this, edit pet, whatever ID it's passed to us. And then of course our def mutation is going to get that ID and figure out what action to do. And then we're also going to co-locate our refresh in this particular case, because we know when we do this routing action that we're going to want to refresh our pet router. That is what ID we gave it, right? Well, actually, pet router isn't queried for. That's the ID of this guy. Router is queried for. So actually, we'll just refresh all the way to whatever queried for the router itself. We have to be a little careful with that, because the different as you recompose, this refresh might then not be right, because here we've depended upon a key that isn't there. If we use a different key to compose it in to the application, so that's one potential concern. We might try. That's going to be ident based. Let's just stick with that for the moment. We can always choose not to co-locate these, but for the moment, let's just do that. Okay, so if we're going to edit a pet, there are a couple things we want to do. The first thing we want to do is make sure the pet form pane pane's idea of which pet to edit is set, and that's just simply setting an ident. So our first thing is going to just be to, well, let's just be a little more clear. The pet ident is going to be a pet by ID, right? That's what this value here is going to be. And what we need to do is we need to swap on the state, do some function on S, where the first thing we do to S is we assoc in at pet form pane. You can see how the dev card is really helping me here. I can just read off the path to the place that goes. So I'm going to put the pet's ident in that location in my state database. And then I'm going to use routing, update routing links, which again takes a state map, so we can thread it through as well and do that at the same time on the handler. Oh, sorry. No, I'm not using a routing tree. Sorry, I keep doing that. If I'm just using a raw router, what I want is set route. State map, router ID, that's my pet router. And then where I want to go. I want to go to the pet form pane. Okay, so that should put the editor on the correct pet and put me in the editor. Now there's something else I need to do, and that's actually need to load some pets, and I'm going to simulate that again in the card. So I'm going to go back to the pet routing card here, and I can pass Fulcro arguments here. And I can put in a started callback to run when my pet routing card starts the application, so that I can integrate some data. Now there's a super handy function for this exact purpose. You're working in dev cards, or you're working with a play application. You don't quite have a server yet, but you know what the data shape looks like. You know you've got a UI component for it. So in the prim namespace, there's a merge component where you give the reconciler, the component, and what data it needs. So I'm going to say reconciler, I want to merge a pet with dbid 42 and pet name Susie. Okay, so now if I, and I'm going to focus in on this card. If I reload this card, we should see Susie appear. And we do. Now notice Susie isn't anywhere linked into the graph yet, right? The pet list is still an empty list of pets. And so merge component also supports some post-named parameters. I think append to is the name, but it's all documented here. Oh, see, integrate ident. All right, so we're going to have to look at the doc string for that. Append, prepend, and replace. So I'm going to append the ident that this pet ends up with to pet list pane. Pet list pets. Right? And again, since this is initial startup, I've got to start the app again, and I do that by reloading the page. And now you can see Susie's in my list. Right? So now to play with this, I can merge a few more. Again, reload to get the data state. Okay, and now if I click, I'm over in there, but it didn't update my pet form. Oh, I didn't unquote my ID, so I ended up pointing at a pet that doesn't exist. Right, so you see I quoted, but I didn't unquote the ID on that edit. So I don't have a mutation yet to take me back to the pet list. I guess we could go ahead and and write that. So def mutation save edits. Don't care about the parameters, and the action here is just a swap on the state to set route on the state map, pet router to pet list pane. And so now in my editor, let me drop some of these other demo pieces so we can pare this down to something we can look at more easily. Pet list, pet form, on change, let's just say on blur. And I'm getting these error underlines because the IDE thinks all mutations should have parameters, so I can always pass an empty parameter list to get rid of the underlines in the IDE. And so now if I should have been if I blur out of that, it should have gone back to my list. Oh, it did. You see it's on pet list pane. It just didn't update because my save edits didn't indicate that the routing UI should refresh. There we go. So Fido tab. Okay, so I'm still not getting pet by ID 42 in the form. Pet 42 should be Susie. Something's definitely going wrong there. So you see when I started to edit, I'm getting an entry in the database table nil. So again, this sort of helps you debug. You know, I didn't see anything in the list even though I clicked on something. And it's telling me the nil right away here. So I'm wondering if I forgot to pass the ID to the on select. In the way it expected it. I passed it as a map, which it wasn't expecting. It was just expecting me to call on select with ID. So I actually did screw up there. So now Fido, and I'm editing Fido. So you can continue this composition to any level, and I typically will split this out into separate cards, separate namespaces. You know, as I get things developed, I'll move the mutations to mutation areas. I'll move the components to their component areas, and clean it up. But because these mutations are tied to the database table and not to the UI location, it's really easy to relocate any of this. The router can be moved, the form can be moved, the mutations can be, relocated to a new namespace. The normalized database really enables you to compose this stuff together, tear it apart, put it back together in a different way, build the app bigger and bigger as you go, and you can play with load and mutate and remotes all from these cards while running against a server. And so the only step you've got to do there is start the server and load the page against the server URL, and you're running. So that's enough for this video. I'll probably do a follow-up that cleans this up a little bit, or starts with it cleaned up a little bit, and then takes it full stack.